And what you don't know about Miami is that back in the 1640s, black pirates came here. Most of them came from the Bahamas. Andros Island was a hotbed for pirates. About a third of the crew members of pirate ships were black. In fact, piracy was the first equal opportunity for employment that blacks had in the New World, and many brothers took advantage of that. Now, if you go to Disney World and you go through the Pirates of the Caribbean exhibit, you don't see blacks among the pirates, but they were there. They had a very, very stable presence in the industry. They were free. They shared equally in the spoils that the ships took, and in fact, some of them emerged as captains of their own ships. The most noted pirate, black pirate that we know of, who came to South Florida was Black Caesar. He operated around Biscayne Bay back in the 1640s. In fact, there's a place on the map today in the Florida Keys shown as Caesar's Creek. That was one of his headquarters in the South Florida area. A notorious pirate who eventually was pressed by the British. There was no U.S. government at that time. The U.S. didn't exist at that time. Pressed by the British government, went around to the west coast of Florida, hooked up with Blackbeard, and the two of them were notorious during their reign of piracy, until finally the British caught them both and they were executed.
Well, Black Caesar would be, he's either mythological or real or somewhere in between that. Hanging out around South Biscayne Bay, there's Black Caesar's Creek. He might have been a fugitive slave from Virginia.
There were two of them, but the main one was the one who operated back in the 1640s. The one who came after, about 100 years later, was just a copycat of no consequence. So the next movement of blacks into what became Miami would have been Bahamians, who came in just during the fishing season, during the turtling season, because tens of thousands of turtles would haul up on these beaches, lay their eggs, and these Bahamians would come over, harvest the eggs, slaughter some of the turtles, take them back to Nassau, and make their living that way. So that was going on many, many years before the first English-speaking white people ever came to South Florida. And those Bahamian fishermen, who would be here sometimes for weeks, if not months at the time, would encounter black escaped slaves coming down mainly from Georgia. And these people were trying to make it to the Bahamas to freedom. So the first ferrying of black escaped slaves we know of from Georgia primarily to the Bahamas to freedom happened with these Bahamian fishermen encountering these people right here on these shores.
Well, the Bahamas was so very close to South Florida, and particularly during the brief British period. In the late 1700s, a lot of the Bahamians came to Florida. A lot of them were wreckers because of the Great Florida Reef. There were no lighthouses at the time, and the first community really was Key West, and that was like the wrecking capital of the world. And they ended up, many of them ended up settling in the Florida Keys, and some even in the Miami area.
And these Bahamians coming in from the Bahamas into Key West began migrating up the Florida Keys, primarily picking pineapples, which was a major crop during that time. That brought many Bahamians here. Many of them stayed, so that by the time Coconut Grove emerged in the 1880s, there was a steady flow of Bahamians already in the Florida Keys and coming in from Key West. As these Bahamians and African Americans, black settlers who were coming down from Georgia, encountered each other in Coconut Grove, in Overtown, there was always a little bit of friction, because the Bahamians had kind of an attitude. They would tell you quickly, we're not ex-slaves, we are subjects of the British Crown, and expected white people to treat them that way as well. So a lot of the early friction in Miami was between African Americans and Bahamians, but particularly between white people and Bahamians, because Bahamians simply behaved differently. They came from a different culture, and they were not as passive or as accepting of some of the discrimination that was so apparent when they came into Florida.
Yeah, the Bahamas abolished slavery in the 1830s. And so the black Bahamians were long, by the time they got here, had long not been slaves. And they were educated, because the English, one of the things the English tended to do everywhere, I think, as a colonial power, they educated people better than most. There was some snobbery, and I think it still exists. I find it today in talking to different people, that the Bahamians just have a very, like the old Americans, the DAR types or something. They were here first, and they feel like they've made a tremendous contribution, and they have.
The Bahamians built Vizcaya. They provided the labor force for Vizcaya. They built many of the early buildings in Miami. Bahamians built the Dade County Courthouse, primarily Bahamians and other blacks too, but they were a part of the workforce all along.
African Americans and Bahamians both, because you've got the railroad coming in with Flagler, right? And it's early African Americans coming down to help build the railroad like they did with the rest of the country, right? And they're coming in, and there's a tourism industry here, there's an agricultural labor, there's a need for domestic labor, and so they're coming in, they're working for white families in the homes, they're also building the streets, the buildings, and huge estates like Vizcaya, and they're also working the land.
But they were particularly important in terms of teaching whites how to use coral rock to construct buildings. And we still have some homes, some structures today that reflect this early influence on architecture by the Bahamians.
But if you've ever tried to dig in our wonderful soil, quote soil, and to think that all they had was a grub hoe, and to plant in Coral Gables, which was all pineland, they had to grub up the palmettos and grub up the rock, and that's why they built a lot of buildings out of coral rock, as they called it.
In the early 1800s, blacks began coming down from Georgia and the other slave states into Florida to join up with the Seminole Indians, who were themselves trying to escape being removed from Florida to be out of the way of white settlement of the South. And these blacks, who were not blood related to the Seminoles, they joined them in terms of a mutual survival strategy, whereas the black Seminoles basically fought with the Seminoles, were interpreters for the Seminoles, and in fact there was some intermarriage between the Seminoles and these blacks who joined them.
Well, one of the main reasons for the so-called Seminole Wars, which are kind of forgotten wars in American history to many people, unless you're Floridian, was the fact that many of the slaves were fleeing into then Spanish Florida at first, and the United States wasn't very happy about that. And so they really started fighting the Seminoles because they had provided sanctuary to a lot of the African slaves.
And it's very important to point out that the black Seminoles were not necessarily dependent upon the Seminoles. Sometimes the Seminoles were dependent upon the blacks. So it was a very symbiotic relationship in which both groups benefited.
I think that one of the unique things about Miami is that if you look at African American history, there's this big period of time that they call the Great Northern Migration, which happened after Reconstruction in the South. So after the Civil War, Reconstruction was an attempt to rehabilitate the South and make it more friendly towards blacks, make it more friendly in general towards northern sort of ideals of democracy and things like that. It didn't work. It crashed, right? So you saw a lot of black people leaving the South. They went to New York, they went to Chicago, they went to major cities. They left all these agricultural communities where they had been based in the South before. And so that period of scholarship, that period of history in African American scholarship is called the Great Northern Migration. But what people don't often recognize is that there was a Great Southern Migration too. Miami was booming in the 1880s and the 1890s because of the fact that it had just been founded. So there were jobs here, the railroad had arrived, there was opportunity here. So you saw African Americans not just going to the north, going to New York, but they were also African Americans from Alabama and Georgia. They were coming down to Miami to find work.
Now, especially around the 1880s into the early 1890s, there were blacks, primarily Bahamians, who were now settled well in Coconut Grove, who worked on these waters. They were fishermen, they were crabbers, they were turtlers, they were tour guides, they were hunting guides. So as white people started coming into South Florida for tourism purposes, they were aided and supported often by blacks who knew these waters, who knew the best fishing spots, who knew the best hunting areas, and they made a living, many of them doing exactly that. All of the blacks were not maids and gardeners and agricultural workers. Many of them participated handily in the tourism trade. We're standing on Charles Avenue in front of the home of E.W.F. Stirrup, the richest black man in Coconut Grove. Charles Avenue was the original avenue along which most of the homes for blacks were built. It used to be known as Evangelist Street because all of the churches were on this street. So this was the beginning community of Coconut Grove, for the black community that is, on this street. Mr. Stirrup was probably the first black, really wealthy person in Miami-Dade County. He acquired a great deal of property. He owned land from Monroe County to Fort Pierce, and when he died, he left a very sizable estate. He was one of the people who could be relied upon to help young men when they got into trouble. He was the one who, when movies came out, would get in his horse and buggy and go up to the White Folks Hotel, the Royal Palm Hotel, get the movies, bring them back down to the Oddfellows Hall, which was the social center of Coconut Grove, and that's how black people got to enjoy movies. This is a very important street. It may be the most historically significant street in Miami-Dade County in terms of black history is concerned. In 1894, this event took place, which became known as the Great Freeze. It was horrendous. People had never really seen anything like it in their lifetimes. Everything froze. Florida was basically under ice. They say it even snowed in North Miami, what's now North Miami. And as a result of that freeze, Henry Flagler was convinced to bring his Florida East Coast Railroad on down from West Palm Beach, on down to the Miami River. So the Great Freeze was the defining moment for the birth of Miami. And it brought as many blacks, if not more blacks than whites, into South Florida because their labor was needed on this land that was below the freeze line. Well, the Big Freeze was an act of God, and that act of God led to the establishment of the city of Miami and the arrival of thousands of blacks into this community. So yes, it was related to a natural event.
When John Sewell came down in March of 1896, he brought, as he put it in his memoirs, about 13 or 14 African Americans who had been working with him in West Palm Beach. And see, West Palm Beach was a staging ground for the elaborate Palm Beach across the lake. And so the really gritty work was done by people living in West Palm Beach, both in West Palm Beach work, but also they were building this great resort called Palm Beach. And Sewell brought down, as he later called it, his black artillery, referring to these voters and all, but these were trustworthy workers because Flagler had told him it's time now to build this great hotel that I've told Miss Tuttle I'm going to build, plus I want it because I'm going to promote that as a tourist spot. And so he brought them down. They leveled the Indian burial mound in March of 1896, right on the edge of Biscayne Bay then. Today it's about 3 blocks in. And they began to lay the foundation for the hotel. So these were workers that Sewell knew from earlier jobs.
The railroad was everything. People can't appreciate that now. But before there was I-95, before there was the turnpike, before there was air travel, there were trains. Everything moved on the railroad. So railroad magnates had a lot of power, a lot of money, a lot of influence. And the railroad also provided jobs. A lot of black people worked on the railroad. One of the best jobs you could have in Miami was to be a Pullman car porter. Working the railroad from Miami to Jacksonville, back and forth. You wore a suit, you had a clean job, you got tips. It was wonderful. That was one of the high status jobs in black Miami in the early years.
Suddenly with the railroad converging on Miami and the right of way, the railroad was laid from West Palm Beach down to the north bank of the Miami River. People come because they can get jobs working with the railroad and get jobs building, get jobs as entrepreneurs, whatever the case might be. So suddenly there's hundreds of people in Miami by the spring, summer of 1896. And the Flagler organization said, this is going to be unwieldy. What we need to do is get this place incorporated. And so they announced in late June they were going to have a pre-incorporation meeting, which they did. They incorporated on July 28, 1896. And about over a third of the voters were African Americans. They had been workers primarily for Flagler under the guidance of John Sewell, a white man. And as he said, he marched his black artillery to the polls. They registered them to vote, and they marched them to the polls to vote for incorporation. As it turned out, it was by acclamation anyway.
Well, when the city of Miami was established in 1896, about 160 or so odd black men, out of a total of 340 or so men altogether, participated in the actual incorporation meeting for the city of Miami. Had the blacks not been there, and women didn't have the vote at that time, but had those black men not been there, the city of Miami could not have been established at that time because the state required a minimum number of voters for a place to become a city, and there simply were not enough white men present in 1896 to make that happen. So they ordered all the Flagler workers in to the meeting, and they were told to vote for the city to become established, and they did.
And they, you know, I didn't know that. That wasn't taught in Miami history. I discovered it much later. In talking to Dorothy Fields, we started reading all of this, and then I had seen their names, see, in the Sewell book. And then I said, wait a minute, his name is here on the incorporation list. There's actually a list. And the first one happens to be black. It's not alphabetical. This was the list.
Blacks were kind of political pawns, as some people say we are today. But essentially, they were used by the railroad, by the flagler structure, to really move whatever political agenda the railroad had.
What's unheard of is that we've got a very important American city that was incorporated so late, 1896, and it had such a sizable percentage of incorporators who were African Americans. That part was unheard of.
Overtown used to be called Colored Town, and it was born when the city was founded, 1896, exclusively for blacks. As the Flagler Railroad came south, a lot of towns sprung up. West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, all of these little towns sprung up as the railroad came through. And in each case, the black community was established in the northwest quadrant of each of those towns. So if you go to West Palm Beach, blacks are in the northwest quadrant. Fort Lauderdale, blacks live in the northwest quadrant. Miami, we live in the northwest quadrant. So unless you think blacks had a chromosome that made us gravitate towards the northwest corners of communities, that would have been a plan. And the plan was for the railroad, plan by the railroad was to have blacks isolated, separated from the rest of the community, but close enough to get to work. So that was the plan for the establishment of these black communities in the northwest quadrant. When Overtown was established, it was a highly segregated community. You couldn't leave Overtown if you were a black person after dark, for example, or you run the risk of being arrested. There was a concerted effort by the powers that be to keep blacks restricted to Colored Town, particularly after dark.
Colored Town, the races by law had to live apart. And so soon as Miami incorporated in 1896, Colored Town is established. Up until then, they settled, they lived in tents or makeshift places around white people. But now that you've institutionalized the city by incorporating, you need to do something about this. And so the northwest quadrant of the city was set aside as an African American community called Colored Town, which is not an unusual name. Many segregated black communities in the South are called Colored Town.
This area has had several names. Originally Colored Town, then Overtown, the Central Negro Business District, all of these names attended to Overtown. But the reason I understand that this area is called Overtown, and a lot of controversy about that, is that if you lived in Coconut Grove, south of here, and you wanted to visit someone black here in Miami, you had to go over downtown to get here. Thus the term Overtown stuck for this area.
I tend to think that earlier period was a great period. Now I understand, speaking as a guy born later and a guy who's a Caucasian, the deprivation that many people experienced there, the outdoor privies, no library for a while, no high school till 1927. But I really think it was a community that really took care of its own needs. And so for me, the golden age, even though there are these problems, you know, with sanitation and Ku Klux Klan, thuggish white policemen, I think it was a pretty good age by and large. The community was forced to be self-sufficient and was self-sufficient.
Oh, I loved it. It was great. It was great. It was like a family. Everybody knew each other. Everybody cared for each other. If you didn't have some flour, if you didn't have some sugar, or whatever you didn't have, you went to your neighbor and you could borrow it. And then your neighbor looked out for you. If anybody saw us doing anything wrong, you know, they would tell you, they would tell my grandmother or tell my aunt.
If you were to ask me where the richest people in Dade County live, I would have to say Fisher Island, behind me. Probably the greatest concentration of wealth in Dade County. But at one time, that island, now named after Carl Fisher, the founder of Miami Beach, was owned by a black man. His name was D.A. Dorsey. D.A. Dorsey purchased that island for the express purpose of having a place where black people could actually get into salt water. So Fisher Island, owned by D.A. Dorsey up until the Great Depression of the 1930s, was the only place where blacks could come, not just from Dade County, but from other parts of the country, to swim and to enjoy the benefits of beautiful Biscayne Bay. When the Depression hit, Mr. Dorsey needed cash like everybody else, and it was during that time that he sold the property to Carl Fisher, who was the developer of Miami Beach, and that's why this is now called Fisher Island. We are standing in front of the Lyric Theater. The Lyric was the social center of Overtown during its heyday. This building was erected around 1917, owned by a black man, Jeter Walker. And everything that happened that was of social importance happened in this building. Its importance to the community culturally and historically is unsurpassed. It's the most historic building still standing in Overtown today. Well, during Overtown's boom, the Lyric was the place to be. You would want to be here to see the latest movies, to be entertained by the biggest entertainers of the time. This was a major place to be during the heyday because of the attraction of this place to so many performers. A lot of the nightclubs in Overtown, the big clubs, attracted many white patrons. They would come to Overtown, not so much for the movies or for some of the more black-oriented events here, but to the nightclubs. A lot of these folks found their best entertainment in Overtown. But even then, even in the black nightclubs in Overtown, they were segregated. The whites had one section, the blacks had the other section. In their own neighborhood, there was segregation. Black Miami, Colored Town, was the Harlem of the South. People called it that, the Harlem of the South. Anything that you could get in Harlem on Lenox Avenue, you could get here on 2nd Avenue or 3rd Avenue, right here in Overtown.
Overtown experienced so many problems with law enforcement, both legal law enforcement, meaning the police, and extra legal. The police, this is a Deep South community in many ways, all the way through the 60s. And the police were just, they were thuggish. My dissertation was on criminal justice, and there were stories where they would look at statistics for a month of arrests, and I think 1 month there were like 38 arrests, 37 were African Americans, yet they only comprised 25% of the population, stuff like that. And then there was the extra legal problem. The Klan entered Miami, as far as we know, in 1921 for the first time, and they would kidnap 2 ministers, one in Coconut Grove, one in Overtown, in 21, tarred and feathered both, pushed them out of speeding cars, attempted to force them to go back to the Bahamas. And the Reverend Higgs in Coconut Grove did go back. There were never any charges, never any arrests, nor any prosecution of those cases. And it was the Klan. And the Klan would march through Overtown. As late as 1939, there was a spring municipal election, and there was a man named Sam Solomon who had organized a lot of new voters in Overtown. And he was going to take them to the polls the next day. And the Klan didn't march, they drove through Overtown. Early May of '39, and they had a sort of a makeshift noose, and they had a black man hanging from it, this, and attempted to vote. But the next day, Solomon marched those people north on 2nd Avenue, which splits into First Place, and then from First Place up to Northwest 14th Street and over to the fire station, which is now being restored. It's over Miami Avenue and 14th Street, and they voted. So the Klan was a force for decades, not just the early and mid-20s, but they remained here. The Klan was, I don't know how robust it was, but it appeared periodically. And by then, its targets are Catholics, Jews, not just black, Catholics, Jews, Filipinos married to, say, a Caucasian woman. I mean, they went after everybody who didn't fit their narrow definition of 100% white American Protestant.
In 1926, there was no weather bureau. People had no way of knowing what was coming from out there. This thing came in late at night, swept across Miami, went right over downtown Miami. The eye passed over downtown Miami. And when it did, people thought the storm was over. A lot of folks who were just new arrivals here, they went running out onto the ocean front to see the damage. The Bahamians knew better. They knew the other side of the storm was coming. So you had all these people who were killed mainly because they exposed themselves to the rushing water coming in on the other side of the hurricane. So it was a great event. It destroyed the city of Miami for the most part, but had an even worse effect on Colored Town, what we now call Overtown. The buildings there were shanties for the most part. They were vulnerable to the storm. Many more folks were left homeless in Overtown than in other parts of the community. So it had a great effect on the city of Miami because after that they put buildings up with bricks and concrete rather than wood. But Overtown was, Colored Town was severely damaged by the storm. Then the city and the county and possibly others went to Colored Town and got the black men to come and help clean up for free, to remove bodies, to clear the streets. And you didn't get to choose not to do it. If they came and told you that you were on a work crew to clean up after the hurricane, you had to go. Well, this was a common practice. If there was a natural disaster, not just in Miami, the modus operandi would be to go to the black community and get black men to come in and clean it up. So this happened in most of the major events that I can think of that required that kind of labor. Blacks were required to do it. The same things that we experienced during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, people experienced that in 1926. But there was no federal government to come rushing in to help. So people had many, many weeks of isolated survival, trying to exist under these horrendous circumstances. But I reiterate that some of the folks here, some of the blacks knew that this was going to happen. I interviewed a lady in Coconut Grove who was alive when it happened. And she said that that night that she woke up her husband because everything outside was yellow. All the elements had changed color, and she had never seen anything like that before. So we know that this was a phenomenon that was associated with that hurricane. I came here when I was a boy of 11 or 12. This was the only place a black person could get into salt water, Virginia Key Beach. This was our beach. Little did we know that there was a sewage treatment plant right around the bend here, but we loved it. We came out here. The state would have state troopers parked on the bridge to keep us from going to Crandon Park, which was the white beach. We were not allowed to go there. But this was just fine as we saw it at that time. The beach was made available to us after the Navy stopped using it to train black sailors to swim during the Second World War. That's how blacks first got onto Virginia Key Beach. It was a military training site for the Navy because the white people here would not allow black sailors to be trained to swim at Crandon Park, the white beach.
Blacks could not go anywhere in Miami-Dade County to a beach. And a group of blacks got together and went to Haulover Beach. And Judge Thomas went out there with them. He didn't go in the water, but people like Mrs. Maydell Brannon, who was active in the PTA, and some of the PTA people, you know, they went out there and they went in the water. And when it was reported, they expected to be arrested. And Judge Thomas had money to bail them out. But when the sheriff went out there, he just said, well, we'll talk about this. And so he got some of the leaders together to decide how to resolve the problem.
There were the NAACP and other groups had a wade-in at Haulover Beach in North Miami, which is a county-owned beach, as a way of showing the county that if you don't allow us to have Virginia Key Beach, we will come to this beach. And that scared the county commission. And for that reason, they voted to establish this beach for blacks within weeks of that demonstration. And that was before the Civil Rights Movement started. The demonstration that led to the opening of Virginia Key Beach was probably the only civil rights effort that touched almost all the black folks. Because you could argue that some blacks got the benefits of the Civil Rights Movement because they got education, they went to colleges and what have you, but everybody could come to Virginia Key Beach. So that one effort issued in a freedom for all blacks, regardless of education or status. So it was a very, very significant change. In the late 1950s, the interstate system was expanding in this country. This is I-95 behind me. I-95 was put in to go directly through Overtown. It divided Overtown into east and west, so that after this expressway was built, people couldn't have easy access to other parts of Overtown, and people had to move. Overtown went from some 40,000 people down to about 12 or 15,000 people in less than a decade. This overpass behind me is just one of the evidences of how the interstate was built to ride over the community, so that if you didn't really want to see black people, all you had to do was not look down. It only comes down when you get up to Liberty City. So the expressway didn't kill Overtown, but it added to the decline very, very significantly. Other things added to it as well, but the interstate system was a major factor in the decline.
Well, you know what? It was called urban renewal. And it meant black removal, I think, because my parents were offered money for their house. And I'm sure that it wasn't the value.
The initial thing apparently was, or one of the early thoughts was to put it over the Florida East Coast Railway right of way. But then they decided to move it west, and it came right through a lot of Overtown. Overtown's population in 1960 was 34,000 plus people, and today it's about 9,500. The expressway is probably the major villain there.
The I-95 helped to tear up the community. The urban renewal, did the same thing. And I think that if we had the insight back then that we have today, that we should have stood up for our community. We should have fought for our community. Because now the way it's going, we're not going to be able to stay there because it's being taken over by developers.
Fidel Castro came to power in 1960, beginning of the year, and that changed everything in Miami. It changed life for whites in Miami, it changed life for blacks in Miami, and it provided a phenomenon that the country had never seen before. The influx of tens of thousands of people in a very, very short period of time, almost all of them settling in the same place. That was the impact of the Cuban migration, the first migration into Miami. Another one followed in 1980 when the Mariels came in, yet another large group of of Cubans coming in, and this time with many blacks among them. The first wave of Cubans who came in were basically privileged Cubans who were trying to get away from Castro. They had education, they had businesses, many of them were doctors, teachers. So they sort of fitted into South Florida seamlessly, particularly since the federal government provided a lot of help for them to make this transition as a way of poking Castro in the eye. Those who came later in 1980 during the Mariel boat lift were more impoverished Cubans, many of them black. A significant number of them had mental problems, law enforcement problems, and they just overwhelmed South Florida in their numbers and in the suddenness of that immigration.
But for the black community, it became very difficult because just when people were starting to hire blacks, they hired all these Cubans instead. And so I remember Dorothy Fields saying we went from second class to third class citizens overnight, and I think that's very well said.
When they came, they got privileges that American black coloreds didn't have. Our government was able to give them things that we didn't get. So naturally there was this jealousy there of all these people coming to town and then able to get jobs. And most colored felt that they were taking the jobs from colored people. My late husband, who wasn't my husband at the time, but was president of the Miami branch NAACP, was saying that they were not taking your jobs. We didn't want those jobs. That blacks had gotten to a point that they no longer wanted to be waiters and doing all the things on Miami Beach. And so these people came and they were willing to do that. And you had to give them credit for what they did because a lot of people who came were already professionals. A lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, a lot of lawyers that all came. And they didn't mind doing almost anything to make a living until they could get to where they wanted to go. And it was because of this diversion, or whatever it is, division of Americans and Bahamians, that for some reason we have always been like the crabs in a barrel, that we just didn't want to see one another get ahead. Whereas the Cubans, the Hispanics who came here, different attitude altogether about what they were going to do. And they stuck together and were able to get something. And just like the Jews. And when the Jews came and they were segregated on Miami Beach, they didn't do anything but go ahead and buy up the beach. They just said, we put our monies together and we'll take over the beach. So there was no dogs and no Jews allowed and no coloreds allowed, and signs were all over the place on Miami Beach. And the Jewish people came and found monies to buy Miami Beach. Trust me, they did what they had to do. We just haven't been able to do it as a people.
Well, Haitians started coming in significant numbers in the 1970s. Surprisingly, they began arriving. No help from the government. The only support they got was from the Catholic Church, Notre Dame Church in Little Haiti, help them. They were left on their own. Even those of us who are African Americans didn't do nearly as much as we should have to help them. But they came in looking for work, looking for freedom, just like the Cubans from Duvalier and others after Duvalier, but they were treated shabbily by our government.
During the 50s, you start to see a trickle, there's always a trickle before there are these mass migrations of other Caribbean groups coming in. In particular, you start to see Haitians coming in and working in the travel and tourism industry, because at the time, Haiti is a major travel destination, and so they're coming to promote that. Some people from the diplomatic corps are living here. And then there's a huge a number of laborers coming into work in the garment industry, which is very huge in Miami during the 50s as well. So you saw Haitian seamstresses coming in into work during that period. But at that time, it was just a trickle. You don't start to see mass migrations of Haitians moving in until the 1970s.
Well, I have never heard of the U.S. government locking out Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, any white folks who want to come here. They more or less have an open access into this country. The browner people become, the darker people become, the less welcome they are in America. That was true when Castro came to power. It's true today.
So what you see in the 1970s is that boatloads of Haitians, because of the political turmoil in Haiti and also the need for increased economic opportunities, start coming to Miami. They're assuming that they're going to be treated maybe the same way the Cubans are being treated, and so there's going to be more opportunity for them to stay here. That's not the case, of course. After they land here, and these are thousands and thousands of people, it kind of freaks the city of Miami out. They're dealing with also the influx of a huge amount of Cubans at the same time. So these policies developed, which are known as wet foot, dry foot. So the wet foot, dry foot policy means that if you are caught on sea, you get returned automatically to your country. But if you're caught on land, then you get processed here. So if your boat lands on Miami's shores and you get out, then you get to go through the due process of figuring out whether you can get political asylum here, whether you can stay. You're not turned around right away. But that policy gets in place mainly because of the Haitian migration in particular. It is only applied to the Haitians.
Unfortunately, the lowest stereotyped group among blacks are the Haitians. We are treating the Haitians in the same way that Southern white folks treated us. We expect them to do the worst jobs. We expect them to be submissive and passive. We disdain their culture, their habits, their religion. I don't see that much difference in the way African Americans treat Haitians today and the way that Southern whites treated us. The influx of the Jamaicans was not nearly as impactful as the Haitians, mainly because the Jamaicans who came were a more educated class. Many of them were oriented towards business. Many of them settled in North Dade, Dade County. So they didn't just move into Overtown or into Liberty City, they moved into the more upscale black communities. So there was not this kind of a problem with the Jamaicans coming in. I did a study of which of the black ethnic groups were doing best in terms of income, education, etc. And Jamaicans came out far ahead of African Americans, Haitians, Cuban blacks, because of what they brought into the country: a work ethic, a business acumen, no emotional baggage with slavery, a willingness to take chances to set up businesses in the white community. So we got to give the Caribbean blacks in general and the Jamaicans in particular credit for having ventured out beyond the normal boundaries that we African Americans set for ourselves. We have a lot of growth to do, just as black people, to come together for mutual goals. I have not seen that happen yet. My experience has been the thing that brings people together is crisis. If you have somebody shooting water hoses and putting police dogs on black folks and you show that on television, a lot of people are moved to action. If you have dead bodies washing up on the shore of Biscayne Bay, for Haitian bodies, it moves people to action. If you have some sort of incredible act of atrocity against people, it brings us together. Even natural events bring us together. So those are the kinds of things that happen or have to happen before you see real movement emotionally, bringing people of whatever race together. That and winning the Super Bowl, or the Miami Heat winning the championship, that'll bring us together quick. When people think of Miami today, they should think Latin. They should think Hispanic. That's what we are. If you want to get away from Hispanics, and you live in Miami, you need to move to Idaho. They are here, they're not leaving. We need to live together. They're not taking over. If they did, it couldn't be worse than it was when the white folks were in charge. It couldn't be any worse than Detroit when black folks took over. I am not moved by this fear that the Cubans are taking over.
Miami, interesting enough, was an early civil rights town, which is interesting, which means that you had some pretty progressive activities here against communism as early as the late 1940s. And in the 50s, you had civil rights activities, for example, attempts to desegregate city park swimming pools. And you had not only African Americans, but you had Jews working with them, which was really interesting, really great. And you had lunch counter sit-ins in 1959, leading to the desegregation of the McCrory's lunch counter in '59, a year before Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was a combination of African-American leaders like Dr. John Brown, but also some Jewish people, Jewish women, some Jewish men, mainly Jewish women, and of course a lot of black ministers involved in that. Martin Luther King was a visitor here on way more than one occasion. With civil rights stuff. So I see Miami as quite progressive in terms of the civil rights movements.
One of the reasons why people don't recognize Miami as having that civil rights movement is because Miami is this tourism town. It's always been a tourism town since the beginning of its period of time. And so it's very concerned, the leaders are very concerned about its public image. So they don't want television picking up news of blacks protesting and bringing up issues of racial discrimination. It's going to cut your tourism down, right? People aren't going to want to come. They're going to have a bad image of Miami. So what's different about Miami from other places is at the point in time when blacks are protesting, when they would bring up a point like that lunch counters needed to be desegregated or beaches needed to be segregated, you'd see all of these backroom meetings where white leaders are meeting with black leaders and they're talking about what they can do to get things changed and done together. So they're working on a more cooperative level than you see at in other states, because whites are very concerned about making sure tourism doesn't die, and it's to the advantage of blacks here. So I think things get done faster, or at least a little more cooperatively than you see in other cities.
There were a number of riots in Miami history, including a very significant one in 1968. But the darkest day in Miami history started here in 1979 at this spot where Arthur McDuffie, a young black insurance man, was set upon by at least a half dozen white Miami-Dade police officers and beaten to death. That was the spark for the Great Riot of 1980. McDuffie was speeding, coming up northeast Miami Avenue, and here at Northeast 38th Street came to a halt. There were several police officers chasing him, and once he stopped, they set upon him, handcuffed him, hands behind his back, and with McDuffie on the ground, started to beat him. One of the officers, a man named Alex Marrero, took his flashlight, one of these long flashlights police officers carry, straddled McDuffie's body as he's prone on the ground, face down with his head against the curb, and struck the back of his head. And that split McDuffie's skull. It took him another day or two to die, but Alex Marrero, one of those officers on the scene, struck the killing blow. Well, they did several things to try to cover up what they had done. One of the things that they did was to get some of the police cars to roll up onto the motorcycle to try to pretend or submit the idea that McDuffie lost control of the motorcycle, flipped over, and died when his head hit the pavement. Unfortunately, the medical examiner wondered why, and they took their flashlights and their nightsticks and they broke the glass on the gas tank of the motorcycle on both sides. Big mistake, because the medical examiner wanted to know if the motorcycle fell on one side, why were the gauges on the gas tank on both sides busted? And that began the official investigation into this murder. The trial of these officers was moved to Tampa because of concern about tensions in the community and these men getting a fair trial. On May 17th, 1980, this all-white, all-male jury in Tampa that heard this case came back with not guilty verdicts for all of the officers involved. And that sparked this riot. Blacks in Miami-Dade County did not riot because McDuffie was beaten to death by police officers. The beating death of McDuffie and the riot itself was several months apart. The riot happened because the people who did it, who committed that murder, got away with it in a court of law, and blacks were simply outraged. Arthur McDuffie was a young insurance man, a former corporal in the United States Marine Corps, father of at least 2 children, no police record, and he left a very, very large family of McDuffies living in Dade County today. Family members of Arthur McDuffie did eventually receive a settlement from the county for his murder, but the scar on the community never left.
I think the riots hurt the city terribly, and what really complicated them was the fact that you had the whole Madiel issue, and you had the cocaine cowboy thing, so you had all these kind of countervailing problems. A girlfriend of mine at that time said, that's got to be the worst city in America to live in. She came from Nebraska. And then some friends of mine in Tallahassee said, how could you ever go back to that place?
After McDuffie was killed and the trial happened that Saturday, I got a telephone call from an Associated Press reporter asking me if I knew of trouble up on 62nd Street in Liberty City. I was at home still reeling from this verdict. I couldn't believe, as most of Dade County couldn't believe, that these people were innocent, but had been found innocent. I came up to 62nd Street, to the Liberty Square housing project that afternoon, and the riot was in full force by the time I got here. Hundreds of young men, mostly men, on the streets, pouring out of the housing project, and they set upon a carload of 3 white people, the Koch brothers, and a young girl who was in the car with them. They were stoned, the car was attacked, the car hit a wall, a little girl was standing there, she was 8 years old, her name was Shamika Perry, and the impact of the vehicle severed her leg. And that really set off the riot in a big way.
Well, that day I was outside playing baseball with my friends, and I saw my aunt and my sister going to the store. So instead of me running to second base, because I was standing on first base and I could see them, instead of me going to second base, I ran the other way to tell my aunt and my sister to bring me something from the store. And I saw people on the street, but I didn't know what a riot was. And the riots, I guess they was just starting. People was on the street, but it was no violence going on at the time. And that's the last thing I remember of that day.
The police had a difficult time responding to this. They had blocked off Northwest 7th Avenue and Northwest 17th Avenue to prevent white people from coming into Liberty City. But somehow or another, a car slipped through with the Koch brothers driving it, these 2 white boys and this girl, and they got caught in this melee. And the amount of anger, the amount of absolute rage was incredible. I saw a group of 20, maybe 30 young black men around these 2 boys. They were on the ground, and they were using a Miami Herald newspaper box that you'd get the street newspapers in to crash down on this boy's head repeatedly. And then there were hundreds of people watching, including me. It was as horrible as any lynch mob in Mississippi because it was purely motivated by rage and race. I called the police department to tell them that there were people being killed on 62nd Street. They told me they weren't ready to come up yet. It was late that night before they finally got an armored vehicle to come up into Liberty City and get these boys who were now almost dead and this young girl rescued from this riot.
I know one named Michael Cope, that's the one that survived. And I forgot the girlfriend name, she was in the car. And then the other Cope brother, I don't remember his first name, but I know they killed him. I think initially when they threw the rock, it was because he was white. But once they pinned me to the wall, I think it just led to a worse situation for them. I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. Yes, I think the people in my community caused the people to hit me. I don't really blame them. I don't blame the people that hit me either. I just think the police is the real cause of the accident because of what they did to Mr. McDuffie. And I guess the black people, because of past history of police doing them wrong, that was their way of retaliating against them. And unfortunately, we do it in our own neighborhoods versus, I guess, peaceful protests or whatever the case may be.
I would tell them this is one of the best places in the world to live. if you come here and you want to be, I say hi and good morning, good afternoon, and how y'all doing to everybody out there, and just be, that everybody we're all God's children, and somebody's just waiting for somebody to say good morning to them or good afternoon or hi, or how's it going, or how you doing today. And I think if we could just get along and live in communities where you could just speak to people and have people understand that none of us are so powerful that we can't relate. And I don't care how much money they've got out there, it's not going to do you any good if you don't help somebody else with it. And so I'd like for all the athletes to know that I want them to get it together and go into communities and help in communities, and especially in black communities where the help is needed. Everybody want to do something on Mama Beach, or they want to do something on Bal Harbour, or they want to do something where other people are doing it already. In areas like Coconut Grove and Overtown and Liberty City, where all those blacks with all that money, all the athletes who come to this town, they talk about South Beach. They don't even know they live in Miami. They don't even know they live in Miami. They think they live on Miami Beach, and then you hear them talk about, I'm going to South Beach. They come into Miami. And so Miami is the place they ought to want to help see change.
Study its origins. Study the origins of the black community in Miami. Why were they living where they lived? Or why were they confined to certain jobs? Why were they disempowered? How have they fought that? How have things changed? I'd study the origins and then compare today with that. For example, little things like we've had a black police chief. Oh my God, we didn't have a black policeman until 1944, and he had limited powers. Or you've had a black school superintendent. African Americans didn't even have a high school until 1927. So there's been a lot of improvement, but I think in order to appreciate the changes, both good and bad, you need to know what happened in the beginning. So I'd say study its origins to understand what was it like then, how it's changed today.
I think the thing I wish people would realize most about blacks in Miami is that we were there from the beginning of Miami's incorporation, and that we played a fundamental role in the development of the city through labor, through building of communities, through fighting for change. There was discrimination here, and fighting for change from the early period of times, from the early 1900s all the way through the 1960s.
I think in 10 to 20 years, the black population of Miami will be an ethnic mix of primarily Caribbean, blacks, and African Americans. I think we'll have far more blacks in Miami in 20 years who are descendant from people who came from the islands or from other parts of the hemisphere and not from the North American continent. It is inevitable. It's not necessarily bad, it's just the nature of change that we can expect. Given the geography of where we are, this is going to happen. Even today, unless a black person opens his mouth or her mouth, you don't really know who you're dealing with. But certainly in 20 years from now, it will be very difficult to pick out an African American or a Haitian or a Jamaican. Well, the Jamaicans always stand out a little bit, but all the others will be able to recognize immediately. I should stop joking about the Jamaicans.
I think blacks in Miami today are in the best position they've ever been. I think that this era when the Hispanics made them third-class citizens, I think that is somewhat passing. If anyone is threatened today, it may be the Anglos, but not really. I'm just joking about that. I think that there are a lot of today, people really respect people for who they are. If you're a jerk, you're a jerk. You're a jerk first, and then maybe the color of you or your ethnicity second.
Well, I think that we need to become more powerful in the positions that we have. We have some black people in some strategic positions, but they're not using those positions to benefit the black people. It's almost as if they're afraid that if they turn around or if they do something, they'll be gone. And this has not been my experience. My experience is that you stand up for what you believe to be right. And so as far as helping the black community, I don't see people who are in positions doing that. They got the position, but what's going on? How are they helping the people who are in need of help? How are they helping the institutions? How are they helping to push the black institutions that are struggling? Where are they?
I think we've come a mighty long way. I think that we've made some inroads. I think we've made some progress, but I also think we've got a whole lot way to go. I'm not happy with everything that's happening, but I'm happy to see that things are changing and that people are beginning to see the importance more and more of why it is that we have to be out there and be a part of what's going on. And having people understand that they need to do more volunteer stuff and not always have to be paid for everything that we do, because there's not that much money out there to just give away, and so we've got to work for it. And I say to young blacks all the time, don't wait for somebody to give it to you. They're not giving it to you. You got to work for what it is that you want out of this life.
But I think a whole new day is arriving and has arrived. And I see it in the tours I do, the talks I give, especially like the Chamber of Commerce's Leadership in Miami. I see so many fantastic young African Americans. I think a new day is arriving. The problem is we got to take care of yesterday, and that would be, what are you going to do with Overtown? And what are you going to do with Liberty City? But I see with so many sharp young people I see, and I think Marvin will tell you the same thing, because he taught at FIU and he saw a lot of this coming up. I just see a whole new day already here. But what are we going to do with yesterday? See, that's the problem.
The struggle is not over. The struggle is still here, because you have now a different culture becoming the majority, and everybody else is becoming the minority, and therefore you got this struggle.